Hello, and thanks for clicking on the video. Here we are in the fourth and final installment of this Elemental Space Marine series that I've been running, and it's time to make the Marine that represents air. If you enjoyed this video and you've missed the other three parts where I make Earth, Water, and Fire Marines, then go and check those out on my channel after this video. As with every part, I'm starting with the Space Marine body. For the Air Element Marine, I've chosen to go with a special body. So I bought a single copy of a Jump Pack Marine from eBay. With each of these Elemental Space Marines, it's been all about the job they do, and that's why this Jump Pack is perfect for representing air. I think Jump Packs are just for big jumps, but I want to take it further and make my guy fly. So as I begin to lay out equipment, I started to think about the weapons and the arms. And the first thing I thought is he should have a small gun, because it would be hard to carry it while he's flying about. I did think about having two guns akimbo style, but I couldn't find a left arm with another gun in it, so I thought I'll give him some kind of tactical device on his arm that he can look at. Then of course he needs a couple of Space Marine shoulder pads, and actually for this model I just kept it simple. I also went with a completely basic Space Marine head, and then I grabbed a whole bunch of these flaps that I found from the Reaver Space Marine kit, and they'd be perfect for adding to this model. I would of course need a base as well. And then I'll need a whole bunch of little things to stick around his belt. So I was thinking potentially other guns, little grenades, little devices and things, and a little purity seal. Then I grabbed my Battlefield Trophies pack and I found a Vespid skull, and I thought that's perfect. Vespids fly, so they'd be the natural enemy of a flying Space Marine. Then I grabbed two guns that were spare from my crew kill team, and I added those to the mix. I had some big plans, but I'm not going to reveal what I'm going to do with them yet. And with the core parts decided, I now had to start thinking about how I was going to modify things and where I was going to stick things. So using trusty blue tack, I blue tacked a couple of these fins onto the back of this jetpack. Then I did the same thing on the back of his leg thrusters and added a couple of flaps to those too. Just so many flaps. And then, as I previously did in my water episode, I grabbed some plasticard because it's time to cut some custom pieces. The Water Marine had watery fins, shaped like fish fins, but this guy's going to have stabilizers or winglets that are reminiscent of the kinds of wings that you see on jets. So using the jump pack as a guide, I cut out something that would be roughly the size I needed, then I used a ruler to ensure I'd get straight lines, and then I used my knife with the ruler again to ensure that I was cutting the straight lines as well. With a little wing cut out, it was time to test it, so I used my trusty blue tack once again to stick it to the side of the jump pack to see how it would work. And then I thought it looked pretty good, so I made a second one and I blue tacked that to the jump pack as well. In my initial ideas, I thought about putting more wings on the shoulders like I did with the Water Marine, but I didn't want this guy to be the same. So I thought I'll add more wings, but this time I'll add them to the legs. So I blue tacked more wings to the sides of the legs. I was thinking that as he's leaning forward when he flies, his legs can go out behind him, and these wings can act like stabilizers for his legs to keep him streamlined and going fast. Plus it creates a kind of consistency between the top and the bottom of the model where both parts now have wings. Once again, similarly to the Water Marine, I thought I could do a head fin, so I tried this idea here, but I didn't like it. So in the end, I just kept the ear parts, but I made them a bit bigger, and they look like this. It feels very Optimus Prime, very Transformers to me, which I really liked, and it's very different from what I did on the Water Marine. Now it's time to take a look at those interesting Kroot guns. And you might be thinking, how am I going to use these Kroot guns? Well, I was thinking Gundam style for this, so I pinched off all the bits that I didn't need, and once I had small gun tubes, I thought, okay, I can clean them up, clean all the fingers off them, and then I can stick them to the model with blue tack where I hope they'll be. Initially I stuck them downwards and they felt way too long, so I then ended up cutting them so that the smaller parts of the barrel were cut away so that there was only a shorter bit of barrel. And you'll see me glue those back together in a minute. For the base of this miniature, I had a couple of failed attempts this week. Turns out trying to make air out of sculpting stuff is really difficult to do. Initially I thought I could make a cyclone by spiraling up some sausage of epoxy sculpt, but I wasn't sure how to sculpt it into wind-looking shape. And then I tried to use paperclip armatures to help me create these spiraling wind vortex shapes. And that didn't really work either. I had no idea what to do after I'd stuck the initial epoxy sculpt on there. So in the end, I went for the top of a cliff. I grabbed a piece of bark and I stuck it on a lump of green stuff at an angle. and then I used all the green stuff and I shaped it with my tools, and then I used a whole bunch of other bark to like press texture into the green stuff. And then I had what I wanted to be the top of a cliff or a peak of a mountain. And with that decided, it was time to start sticking the main pieces of the miniature all together. So the first thing I did was I glued all the wings to the model, starting with the legs and then doing the ones on the jump pack. Then I glued the extra flaps from the Reaver kit onto the top of the jump pack above the existing flaps that it already has. And I like this because it gives me Guardians of the Galaxy Milano vibes. Then I clipped off a bit of the detail on the back of the thrusters on the legs, and I used the flat area I'd now created to stick more flaps on the back of those thrusters. And then it was time to use plastic glue to stick the arms on, and I started with the left arm, which has no weapon, and then I glued on the right arm with the gun. With everything dry on the backpack, it was time to glue that to the back of the model. And I'm hoping that the wings and the flaps are really going to sell that this guy flies more than he jumps. Then it was time to stick the Optimus-shaped head on, and I wanted to make him extra badass by making it so that he's not looking where he's shooting. Then I glued both the shoulder pads on, and as before, just kept it simple this time. He's the only one of all 4 of the Marines that has nothing really special about his shoulder pads. And that's fine because he's supposed to be streamlined. He's supposed to be flying through the sky, so it doesn't make sense to have a load of stuff stuck to his shoulders. Admittedly, I tried to glue the model to the base, but it didn't work very well, so I ended up having to pin it so that it would stay in place nice and strong. I used a tiny piece of paperclip, and I just inserted it into a hole I drilled into the bottom of the foot, and then I stuck that into a hole I drilled into the bark in the base. Now, I didn't want to fully reveal yet the guns on the top of the jump pack, but I did kind of show a hint of what it would look like earlier. But I did want to grab 2 ammo pieces from the Space Marine Intercessor kit and snap the ammo clips off. My plan is that these were going to be ammo clips for those guns on the jump pack. And then with a few extra details glued on and the base sorted out, this is what the miniature looked like. Those guns on his jump pack certainly make an impression, and I hope it gives you a kind of Starscream Transformers or a Gundam vibe, because that's what I was sort of going for. With all the flaps and wings, I'm hoping he looks a lot more like a jet than a normal jump pack Marine, and I hope that makes it more convincing that he flies through the sky. Seeing as he only has a small gun in his hands, that firepower on the top of the jump pack was essential in my ideas for making him feel like he's some kind of aerial fighter. So now I have to paint him, and I've got to stick to the same kind of painting styles that I did in the previous episodes. So because it's sensible, I decided to paint the interior parts of the miniature first, and that starts with the black undersuit. I then coated all the parts that I was going to paint with metallic paints later, black as well, because the metallic will cover better over a black base coat. I forgot some of the black parts, but with most of them painted, it looked like this, kind of like a stormtrooper. And my thought for this scheme was that once again I'd go dark on the middle and the upper parts of the model and light on the legs and arms. And because I thought of air as clouds and smoke and things like that, I wanted to go for greys. It would also be separate from all the other 3 models I did, and I wouldn't then have similar colour models. So I used deep grey from the Army Painter Fanatic range, and I used that to cover the chest, head, and the jump pack and shoulders. I really wanted to use Sky Grey to do the arms and the legs because it's so aptly named. However, in the end I thought it was just too light, so I ended up going over all of this with Stonewall Grey, which is what you're seeing in this clip here. Stonewall Grey from Vallejo is just that little bit darker, and that would allow me to create more depth with lighter highlights, and make the jump between the legs and the chest not as large in contrast. I had forgotten to paint the knee, the deep grey, so I did that next. That's just something I've done on all these miniatures for consistency across the group, as I'm hoping it will make all 4 Marines look like a squad in the end. I added Rhinox hide to all the bags and leathery parts of the model around the waist and the legs. Seeing as most of the model was going to be greys, there wasn't going to be a lot of colour, and this little part of desaturated brown would give me a little pop of something different in the middle of the model. As I've done on all 3 other Marines, the trim around the shoulders and the Aquila on the chest is always a darker colour, so for this time I've used a very dark grey. I used charcoal from Vallejo. And I also decided to use this paint to paint all my flaps. For the wings on the legs, I used the deep grey that I used on the chest for those, but for the wings on the jump pack, I used the dark grey that is the shoulder trim, so that every time the wings are separate as a slightly darker element from the pieces next to them. Just to do something different on this guy and to lighten up some parts of the models, I used some light grey, so that stonewall grey I used on the legs and the arms, on the faceplate in the helmet. I personally just really love it when the face part of the helmet is painted a different colour, and I think if I was doing my own custom chapter, I would probably do that. I made the fins on the side of the head the same grey as the legs and arms so that they'd stand out. And with that painted, we had nearly all the base coats on the model. Because the sky is blue, I wanted to add a tiny bit of blue to the model, so the small bit of wax on the purity seal and his eyes I covered with an initial base coat of anthracite grey from AK 3rd Gen. I decided to tackle the base later on, so the next stage was to start shading all the recesses between the armour panels. Because I'm using greys in this paint job, I pretty much just added black to my base coat mixtures, and that gave me the shadow colours I would need for this. When you're doing this, only add a tiny bit of black. Black is really powerful when you mix it into other colours, so if you're using a light grey like I am here, make sure you only add a tiny bit of black into that mixture when you're creating your shadows. I work around the model, shading in the various recess areas as neatly as I can, but not worrying too much because I can always come back with the base coat colour and fix up anything later. And with my shadows in on the main two armour parts, this is what I've got, and you can start to see there's a lot more definition now in those recesses. I decided not to do any recess shading on the charcoal parts on the shoulders and the front of the chest, just because those parts were smaller and I didn't need to worry as much about giving them so much definition. Switching to highlights, the first highlights I did were a dark grey on the black undersuit parts, as they're the hardest to reach. I followed that with highlighting my deep grey, and for that I just used the Army Painter Fanatics grey hexad, and I think the next step up was uniform grey. I always say it, but it's amazing how much these highlights bring out the edges, help define the model, and really just help it look way more complete and epic. So with the highlights done on the dark grey sections, this is what it looks like. Now, before I do the highlight on the light grey areas, I wanted to do a bit of cleanup first, so I took my base coat of Stonewall Grey and I neatened up some of my lines, making the shadows that I put in before neater and thinner, and making sure anywhere where I accidentally spilt a bit of the darker grey shadow over the light grey base area, that I just come in with a brush and fix that up. So now it's time to do the highlight, and this time I did use Sky Grey, because Sky Grey is much brighter than Stonewall Grey. It makes the perfect jump for a highlight. As I apply it, it looks really bright, but as it dries, it becomes a little bit darker in colour, so it's not as contrasty as it looks in the end once it's dried. Because of all the extra bits and bobs that I've stuck to this miniature, it was quite hard to reach some of the areas to do these highlights, so it did make a bit of a mess, and I did have to come in and clean them up either with the shade colour or the base coat. With the first layer of highlights now finished on the dark grey and light grey parts, this is what the model looked like. And now I need to make sure I do a highlight on the very darkest parts on the shoulders and the aquila. I can't remember exactly what colour I used for this highlight, but I'm pretty sure that I just added a lighter grey to my charcoal. I whipped out the metals after I'd done the highlights and began to base coat all the areas that were going to be metallic. That included the gun, the big guns on the jump pack, the dongle on the chest, as well as some of the grenades and other bits around. This time for the metals, I used steel from Vallejo Mecha Color. I tried dark steel in a previous video, but this time I wanted to do things ever so slightly differently and use steel and then cover everything in a big old wash of Nuln oil. My thoughts behind this were that a wash would be much faster than doing two base coats, and to be honest, when I'd previously done a darker silver and a lighter silver, it hadn't really created the level of contrast I'd always been looking for, so I thought the really dark recesses that would be created by a nice thick layer of Nuln oil would probably give me more contrast overall, so I thought I'd try it on this one and see how it goes. Then I came in and I highlighted all my leather bags. And for this, I basically just added one of the light greys on my palette, probably Stonewall Grey or Sky Grey, and I added that to my brown Rhinox hide that I'd used for the base coat, and that gave me a slightly desaturated, lighter brown grey that I was using. I then added even more of that colour and did a second layer of highlights just for very bright points, and then my leather was done and it looked like this. Next up, I began to work on some small details. So the first of those is the parchment on the purity seal. I took my Rhinox hide base coat and I basically just started adding Xandri dust over the top. And then once again, to save some paints, I used a light grey on my palette, which was Sky Grey, and I added that into my Xandri dust to get a much lighter colour that I could use for the final highlight. Following the highlights, I decided to try and freehand little lines of text on the parchment. And I did this with charcoal, not with a pure black. For the wax on the purity seal, I added ice yellow to my anthracite grey base coat, so I got a slightly more green, light blue highlight colour. I did 2 rounds of that, going up to a much brighter colour. And then I began to start putting base coats over the skull on the base. This Vespid skull is a nice little feature. I don't want it to draw too much of your eye, but I do want it to be interesting. So using one of the paints that I've already got on my palette, which was the first layer of highlight that I used on the leather bags. So it was essentially Rhinox hide mixed with a light grey. For the highlight on this skull, I used Xandri dust first, and then I moved to a much brighter Screaming Skull for the final layer of highlight. Now I felt like before I painted the last bit of the base, the main bit, I should go and do the final highlights on all the armour. So now moving up to Ash Grey in the Army Painter Fanatic range hexad for greys, I then worked around and I just did that final highlight on the dark grey areas of the chest and upper parts. I did the same thing on the lower parts with the lighter grey, this time adding white to Sky Grey to lighten it up a bit more and then using that. For the eye lenses, I didn't want to leave them white as I did on the Water Marine, so I wanted to add in a bit more blue to represent that sky part of the air. And this time I decided to use Magic Blue, which is a really saturated blue, and then a bit of Sunrise Blue, which are both from Vallejo. And I used those to just add a bit of focal area into the eyes, which you'll get to see at the end in the reveal. And so with all that done to the miniature, it's now time to paint the base, which is the last thing I'm going to show. And I started by using grey brown from AK 3rd Gen. The second thing I did was add a whole wash of Agrax Earthshade over everything. Washes work particularly well over these messy textured surfaces, so it made a good option for quick and easy recess shading. I then came back in with my rock grey and mixed in a bit of warm grey from AK 3rd Gen in order to get my first layer of highlight, and then I did a second layer of highlight with even more warm grey mixed in. I kept my highlight scratchy and rough to emulate the textures of rock, and then it's time to do the final reveal. Once again, I've somehow managed to work my way to another fantastic miniature. I'm really happy with this guy and how he's turned out. I think he makes a great addition to this collection to finish off the Elemental Space Marine. I hope you've really enjoyed this series overall. For the channel, I've got loads more cool plans, lots of cool videos on the way. They won't all be like this, but some will, and I might revisit this kind of stuff in the future so that I can make more series based on this kind of concept. Also soon, I'll be releasing a short on my channel that shows all 4 of the Elemental Space Marines together, so you get the chance to see all 4 of them as a squad. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.